welcome to the Innovation and Diffusion podcast. Today, we have Thomas Philippon with us, and I'm very happy to have you here, Thomas. Welcome. How are you doing?
Good. Very glad to be with you.
It's so great to have you here. Thomas Philippon is a professor of finance at New York University Stern School of Business, and he was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF in 2014. And he works on macroeconomics, finance, and firm dynamics. Today, well, instead of finance, we're going to focus a little bit on competition, market concentration, productivity puzzle, and the book that he wrote, which is the title is The Great Reversal. And I'm actually quite excited to have you here because I know your work and I have been reading your book. I think it's a really nice written book, and I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you. I did spend a lot of time writing it.
And the writing language is amazing, actually. I mean, the introduction, even the economics part of it, I think it's really, I kind of feel like I'm entering your brain and your way of thinking. It's amazing.
That was the idea, but it took a long time.
I'm sure it did. So I think economists actually should write even more books, I think.
No, economists should write better. It's striking how much worse the writing is today compared to, if you read, you don't even have to go very far. Like everybody would think about Adam Smith, but forget about that. You don't need to go that far. Go back to read Milton Friedman. In fact, read Bob Lucas. Bob was a brilliant writer, and I think today I can't say the same.
Okay. Do you mean so? Do you want to specify it a bit more, or?
I think that so I'm not sure why actually. I don't have an explanation for it, but I think there was a premium on writing well that has somewhat disappeared, or completely disappeared, to be honest. That's also my own, to be clear, that's my own preference. I'm a very picky reader and I love things that are well written. And so when I write myself, especially a book like that, where I feel it's for the slightly more general public, I think it's the duty of the writer to write well, because it's painful to write bad sentences. And I just think it's a shame. But I'm clearly in the minority on that one.
Do you think ChatGPT is helping in that sense?
I think it might actually. I mean, I guess it's too early to tell, but I think it might. I haven't used it that much for writing myself, but it might, because it saves you time to get the first draft. I mean, the good writing is usually not the first draft. Good writing is being relentless about cutting stuff. You write it and then you're like, there's too many commas, too many very. Like, you should never use the word very, unless exceptionally maybe otherwise people put very everywhere. It's like, no, you don't need to. So I think like being relentless about cutting and simplifying the sentences, I think it's that's the key. So you could imagine that, the time you save drafting the first draft using GPT, then that time you save there, you can use it profitably later on to improve the prose. I mean, clearly the prose coming out of GPT is pretty terrible. If it saves you time, then you can fix it later.
Right. Yeah. So let's see how it unfolds. I mean, I think everyone is using it as a research assistant right now. So let's see.
No, but it is already amazing at finding it. It is strikingly surprising. Also, it's surprising in what it can do and surprising in the mistakes it makes. It's like, I don't know, it's like a toddler with the brain of a genius, but the two are not connected. So it can, at the same time, write something somewhat coherent about a very, very advanced topic. And the same exact machine will make a mistake that my 6-year-old would not. So, that's interesting.
It is. Actually, that's a really good description of it, actually. So it probably needs even more time to progress. So let's start with you first, Thomas. So I generally ask, our guests how they got interested in economics, and in your case, finance as well, and how they kind of found their interest in specific topics, like, for example, the topics that we're going to talk about today. So can you tell us, what originally drew you to economics and finance? Was there a specific person, or kind of a real world problem that made you even more interested in economics?
So the only real choice I made was economics. Everything after that happened by accident. Finance is most definitely an accident. Initially, so I was a physics major. So I knew I loved the academic research, so I was going to do either quantum mechanics or fluid mechanics or something like that. That's the stuff I liked when I was an undergrad. But at some point, I thought to myself that I don't think I would be happy just looking at particles for the rest of my life, because although I did enjoy it a lot, I felt like there was a side of me who was definitely much more like socially grounded, and that this would be missing. And so I switched very, very late. All my undergrad, I was doing physics. And then very late, I switched to economics. And then all my physics buddies told me I was betraying science to become an evil capitalist, as you can imagine. So the motivation there was very social. It was just so growing up, I was in France in the 1990s. So clearly, topic number one was unemployment. Why do we have so many unemployed people? So it was clearly something that I was highly motivated to understand. Let's put it that way. And in fact, my master dissertation was about that, but the impact of minimum wages on unemployment. That's what I started doing.
I
And
see.
then, yeah, no, so very, as far from finance as you can imagine. But I had no interest in finance whatsoever then. And then after that, I went to LSE for a year, and that was already a great experience. It was very open, met many wonderful people. I love London as well, but also intellectually it was very nice, very eye-opening. And then I moved across the Atlantic to MIT, and I think honestly I learned my trade at MIT, starting from scratch again, because there it was everything is open, any topic you like. And at that point, I really got into microeconomics, and clearly that's when I started thinking about those topics that really interested me. And that's it.
Didn't it scare you to switch subjects? Like you switched from, physics to economics, and then you also, changed countries. And so do you
Mm.
feel comfortable with such changes, or, because you follow your interest, maybe that was like easy for you to do?
Probably like every researcher, I'm probably somewhat overconfident. I didn't
Okay.
really, no, I can't say I really doubted myself very much. I had this certainly somewhat mistaken belief that whatever I wanted to do, I'd be able to do it. So I honestly, I did not think twice about it. And then, but also, um, I don't want to make this is very grounded in. It doesn't happen like suddenly you wake up and you do something. It also happens like organically when the people you meet. So when you're at MIT, your classmates are wonderful, and then I got to meet Olivier Blanchard and the whole crew there. Darren was there, Ricardo Caballero. I mean, it was like an amazing place. Esther and Abhijit. I mean, it was just like and then they're all family now. And so when you're in this environment, you don't really think about the things you can't do. You think about the things you should do. And that's more or less what happened to me.
So do you think, maybe last question about, your undergrad actually, did physics, studying physics shape the way you think? Or I
Tiny
don't know,
bit.
did maybe,
Yes, a little bit. I mean, most people would say, yeah, of course, some of the math is the same. Okay, fair enough, it's true. But I don't think for me it was like that important in the sense that I knew some math, that was never like the big issue. But no, from physics, in fact, the thing I was good in physics, I was never like a math genius or anything. But the one thing I was good at is I had like a good intuition and a good sense of what's first order and what's not first order. So it was always about, making the right approximation and having a sense of like there is no point being amazingly precise about something if you've been sloppy about something else. Because at the end of the day, it's the minimum approximation that wins the day. So that's something I carried into economics. So I think that idea of everything you do is an approximation, and you should just be having in mind what's first order, what's not. Yeah, I think that's from there undergrad.
I see. And also, did it surprise you to actually see, for example, there are some notions that are brought from natural sciences to economics, like steady state, for example. Like seeing those notions that exist in, physics, did that strike you as like, what is this doing here?
So once you formalize things, then so yes to your question, but at a very early stage of the process. Once you've decided on the formalism, then it's just the math. The math is the math. But the early on, like I still remember when the first time I took a class in economics and I saw people writing these utility functions, and I thought that was just completely insane. So that took some time to understand, but it was mostly my misunderstanding of what it was supposed to be. It was just an approximation. And if you think about it that way, then you understand an approximation is right or wrong. It's useful or not. And so, I think it's actually useful most of the time. But once you accept the formalism, after that, every other notion is pretty straightforward. Except the thing in economics that's different is the fact that agents think and particles don't think. The physical world doesn't think, but agents in economics, people think. And so you need to take into account their beliefs and how they form their beliefs. Purely in terms of science, that is the one defining feature of economics, for sure. And that's the part that we are kind of making progress, but quite far from having the right tools, probably.
I see. It's actually a good way of understanding economics a bit, like when you think of it as like approximation. And I think it's a really good way of thinking. Along the way, all this process and stuff, like, was there a person, like a mentor or an economist that shaped that maybe kind of made you even more interested in your fields now? Like, or was there a philosopher maybe that kind of influenced the way you think and the way you want to, work on these economic issues?
I mean, if I have to give one name, it's obvious. It's Olivier Blanchard. That's clear. Because I don't know, we became friends quickly, and I always thought of him as a mentor. So, and his way of thinking, kind of emphasizing clarity and some form of modesty about, yeah, like you want the models to be clean, but you also don't take the model 100% seriously, which I think that's the way he would think about it. And my way of thinking would just keep remembering the model as an approximation, but I think it kind of means the same thing. So I think that's, yeah, probably Olivier would be the most influential. Over time, I mean, again, going to MIT was just, I mean, I had Daron Acemoglu that I saw all the time, Ricardo Caballo, and then Jean Tirole was also, like, talking with them is always just, you learn so much. It's great. And outside my field, I have to say that I would put Esther and Abhijit also pretty high up.
Right. And also, I mean, it's a great bunch of people, and at the same time, there are so many great French economists, right? Like Olivier Blanchard, like as you mentioned, like you, and then there are so many others that I know, like from France. And it's actually sometimes it makes me wonder, and Italians too, like why do some nations produce even more economists or like more influential, impactful economists? That's a question that I always kind of wonder. Is it because of the kind of the social or economic environment? Is it because of the, I don't know, institutions that push people more into social sciences and think, about these issues? But yeah, so
I think that you can definitely trace some to the roots of the issues from of the countries where they come from. Like there is a lot of amazingly talented international macroeconomists come from Latin America. And that's not so surprising, right? If you think about, if you want to have something, and if you're interested in like debt crisis, exchange rate issues,
I
yes.
see.
Like
That's true.
if you grow up in a country in Latin America, then it's pretty obvious that's gonna be like high on your mind. Coming from France, anybody who grew up in France in the 90s would have had unemployment as a big issue in their mind. I mean, that's, of course. Italians have produced great macro people and amazing political scientists. Like politically, that's probably not so surprising either, right? So
Right, yeah.
clearly, you can try some of these. And the UK, needless to say, of course, you see the tradition of, it's actually much more widespread in the UK. The topics are much more evenly distributed because you have amazing people in labor, macro, trade, actually industrial organization as well. But you can link it to the development of the UK also. So I think sometimes, in addition to the obvious randomness that just happen to be the way they are, but I think some of the country level traits that you can recognize, I think some of them are not so hard to spot, I would say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. There is some association there. So let's start, some of like talking about some of the the research questions. As I said, today we're going to focus a bit more on like competition, productivity slowdown, and labor share of income, whether it's falling, increasing. So we're going to talk about these issues, but I want to start with a statement and maybe get you whether you agree with this or disagree with this. Let's open the topic with this one. So if I were a businesswoman and if I said, the US markets are the most competitive in the world. It has never been easier to start a business. Competition is everywhere. Internet allows, people for entrepreneurship and it allows us to access lower prices. What would you say to that? Would you agree with that statement?
I would say that it's plausible sounding and half of it is wishful thinking. So it's plausible sounding in the sense that, yes, we all thought that internet would, so in our models, typically, these are under the headline search costs. So, like before you had search engines, before you had website where you could compare the price of airline tickets, it was more difficult to compare prices and therefore more difficult to find the better deal. And so it's very clear in theory that if you have a technological evolution that allows consumers more easily to compare prices, then in most cases you end up with a lower profit margin for businesses and more competitive markets. So that's very plausible. The empirical question is whether that's actually happening. And because there are many countervailing forces. If you have this kind of technology, to the extent that the technology itself has some return to scale, it might also lead to concentration of the players themselves. So once you take into account these countervailing forces, it is not totally obvious that at the end of the day, we're going to have lower prices. So it becomes like an empirical question. And there, I think the evidence is decidedly mixed. And or definitely, let's put it that way. If you had made a poll of economists, late 1990s, about the impact of internet on competition in the consumer market, I think everybody would have said, yeah, it's for sure it's going to increase it, and we're going to see lower prices. And I think compared to what people would have expected, what we saw was not as much. But it's probably still positive in some sense. So I still think that overall, I would guess that the overall effect is positive. Now, so the other part of the statement is two. One is it's never been easier to start a business. And the second one is the US market are the most competitive in the world. So let's go through them. So never been easier to start a business. So what is for sure is that some of the fixed costs of starting a business have become lower. I mean, the prime example is you can rent most things now, and especially anything that has to do with online services. There used to be a big fixed cost, like you had to buy your own servers. That's gone because you can rent it, and you can rent exactly the capacity you want from the cloud. So that for sure makes starting a business easier. And I think that it's fair to say we see that in the data. So there's plenty of this positive trend that we see where I would actually agree. On the other hand, it is also true that the cost of starting a business includes many costs. And if you bring one down to zero, but the other one remain pretty high, at some point, you're going to have decreasing marginal returns. Even if search costs become very small, even if renting space on the cloud from AWS is very, very cheap, you still have the other costs. So to the extent the other ones don't go down, the impact on actual entrepreneurship might not be as large. So that's always something to keep in mind. And then the statement about the US market being the most competitive in the world, then that's a comparative statement. So internet has improved competition everywhere. Everywhere it's easier to start a business. Now, whether the US market specifically are the most competitive, I think that's what I wrote in the book. That's what has changed. But there it's also a little bit like internet might be the only place where the evidence is murky. But remember, the internet is not a huge share of what people spend. When we think about competitive markets, what's most important is food, energy, housing, healthcare. These are the big ticket items for most people. So these are the market that matter if you want to think about whether people in the US get a good deal or low prices. And I think in most of these markets, I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
So then when since we're talking about, the competitiveness aspect of it, and, one of the greatest puzzles now in economics, there is a huge debate about this, like the slowdown in productivity growth, declining labor share and income, and business dynamism. So, and you have the Great Reversal book where you talk about, these topics actually. What is happening actually there? What does the data tell us?
So let's talk about competition first, maybe. The first thing to say is, which is the labor share is going to move down if markups go up, because it's kind of almost like accounting at that point. The share of profit that goes to business doesn't go to labor, and so the share of labor in total income goes down. So the share of profits, so the share of after-tax profit in national income in the US is as high as it's ever been. So that's the fact. If you go deeper behind the fact, then you have all the great work by David Otto, John Van Reenen, and so on, okay, but where is that coming from? Because it could be that the average firm is getting higher profits, or it could be that it's really that some of the very large firms are taking higher share of profit than before. And so what they show convincingly is that this impact of very large firm or firms that initially had high profit becoming even larger. I think that's very important to keep in mind. So, and that changes a little bit the way you think about the root causes. But apart from that, if you look at the total data, the decline in the labor share linked to the increase in profits, especially after-tax profits in the US, is very striking. And it is not the same in many other countries. So in Germany, it's flat. In France, it's flat. And the UK, maybe a little bit in between. So yeah, so I think and to me that's relatively important, because if you think about broad explanations, if it's purely technology for most sectors, again, let's maybe put the high-tech sector separate, because there is the high-tech sector is a little bit special in the sense that right now there is two countries that have a big high-tech sector, China and the US, and these are somewhat specific. But if you look at the rest of the economy, I would say that most firms in the developed world use more or less the same technologies. So a typical manufacturing firm in the US, Germany, they kind of more or less use the same technology. So if you see different evolutions, it's unlikely to be driven by technology. And like our airline price tickets, there are two manufacturers of airplanes, I mean. So everybody's using the same airplanes. Everybody's using more or less the same software to define routes and optimize flight patterns. So I don't think the technology can explain much. And the price of airline tickets that used to be so much cheaper in the US compared to Europe, now that's clearly reversed. I don't think that's technology. So for that part, I think that the impact of competition is very important. The clear example is the one that everybody who's crossed the Atlantic knows, which is we pay a fortune for our cell phone services and internet here that probably twice as much as what you pay in London. So I think to me this was the thing that hinted at other forces. But it's clear that at the end of the day that you have both strong technological changes and the impact of competition policy, and both of them shape what's going on. And so you have to understand both. And it's not about figuring out essentially like one story is not right for everything. The only question is that story 50% right for that industry or not?
So there are actually several things that I want to ask, but I think one of the things that we can think about is when you think about the labor share of income and if it's, declining, one of the reactions could be that, oh, okay, it's capitalism. We weren't expecting it to be high and it's normal for it to decline. But I guess based on the data that, you described, this is something even more specific to the United States. Is that
Oh,
correct?
some part of it is like the huge surge in after tax profit is something that's definitely US based. And then, it's reflected in the valuation of US firms. They make more money, they have higher stock prices. So, in the grand scheme of things, it's a transfer of wealth from labor earners to shareholders, broadly speaking. And a part of that has definitely a US specific flavor. Now, you could still say that. But then the tricky thing is to decide whether is this like a bug or a feature in some sense. Like, is this something that was a price to be paid for the perceived dynamism in the US, or is this a bug? And there, I think that so what I pushed against to some extent is the idea that this was all a feature, because I think you see it in industries that are not innovative in the US. Again, it's the fact that you pay so much more for airline tickets, cell phones, food, the fact that most energy prices at the initial level tend to be lower in the US, and still you end up having pretty high energy bills in most places. But that's like in the margins of the intermediary sector. None of that has anything to do with innovation, and none of that is necessary, in my opinion. So if the US had more cell phone providers, AT&T would pay lower dividends and cellular prices would be lower. That's simple. And nothing else would change. It's not true that it would be less innovative. But that doesn't mean it's true for all sectors. And there are clear sectors where this appeal of some form of winner take all is pretty important. And you could argue that it is this appeal of being the winner that motivates people to try very hard. And it's not implausible in the tech sector. And then you have stuff in between where it's very hard to tell. And to me, by far the most frustrating, complicated one is healthcare, where for the life of me, if I had to pick a side, I would still be unsure. Because you could say that it is true that the US is funding a lot of research, and it is also true that the rest of the world is benefiting from it to some extent. But at the same time, you have these very high prices for consumers here for products where you don't really see the immediate impact on innovation. So I think that you could very well imagine the US where healthcare would be cheaper and it would be just as innovative. But it's a complicated one. You have two very clear forces in the way we think, in our model, in the way we think about it. One is high profits motivate people to try hard to get the high share of profits. So to the extent that trying hard means innovating, the expectation, the anticipation of high profits can be a great engine for innovation. And there is no denying that's true. On the other hand, it's also very clear that the first thing you do after you have a successful innovation, you try to prevent the other guys from catching up with you. And therefore, every successful firm, it is in their own best interest to turn into a monopolist that prevents the next wave from catching up. That's also, there is nothing to argue against that. It's obviously true. So the only question is the balance between these two forces and maintaining the balance. And my sense from the US is in many sectors, in many industries, that balance was better in the 80s and 90s than it is today.
Actually, that brings us to, because, we think about all these, let's call them, superstar firms, right? We have Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and like really huge firms, which are also discussed in another hypothesis that their productivity gains are higher, etc. But Is this the first time in history that such firms existed? No, right? I mean, in the
No.
history, we had
Yeah.
such big firms. And how was the dynamic back then? I mean, was it similar?
So that actually is a very important point, and it's something. So I've looked again at the sometime for interviews like that. I've looked again at the book, which remember was written before COVID. So and thinking about what has changed and what I would write differently today, and that is one thing that has changed to some extent. So first question that you ask is this new to have superstar firms? And then obviously not. I mean, that started with the expansion of large scale manufacturing and then railroad and things like that. So that's a 19th century. Firms used to be small, that is true, and they became large in the 19th century for obvious reason, which is that you needed a lot of capital for some of the industries. And so as soon as you have that, then you have very large firms. We had very large firms in transportation, in oil refineries, in steel production, and they were large because it was efficient for them to be large, and they were the superstar firm of their time. And interestingly enough, some of them were very innovative, actually. Like, people tend to remember Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and these guys as evil. But if you look at the data, they were also like, it was a very efficient company. They were extremely innovative in process management, and they actually created a lot of productivity gains. Now, you could argue they abused it after, that's for sure, but they were very innovative. They got there in large part because they were innovative as well. So that's not new. And then if you fast forward to post World War II, same thing. So you just change the name of the industry, obviously. For a while, AT&T was the giant in the US. So the telecom industry was long distance communication was the thing. And there was one big giant firm there. It was a superstar as well. Then you have IBM, and then you have Microsoft. And so the names keep changing, but the idea that, and these were all superstar firms in their own right. So superstar firms have always existed. They've, at least in the US, they've always been extremely innovative. In fact, that's the strength of the US, which is in the US, you don't become a superstar firm unless you are actually very productive. So that's good. And that's always been like that, at least for 150 years. And then the question is, okay, are they very, very large or not? And that's where it actually becomes a little bit tricky. And that's why I push back against some of the superstar ideas. So the first thing is, how do we decide whether they're big or not? Well, you have to compare to something. So typically you compare to the side of the overall size of the economy. Now you could do it in valuation using stock markets, or you could do it using like total sales or total income. So if you did with the stock market, you would find that the top 5 firms roughly accounted for something like 10% of the total valuation of publicly traded companies in the US. And that number was remarkably stable throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And then the break is COVID. So it is true that since COVID, we had an extremely quick and large increase in the share of total stock market value concentrated in just a few firms. So roughly it's doubled what it was historically. So that is something that happened after the book was written, and it's pretty striking.
Do we know why? Like, this happened specifically after COVID?
There's a sense in which COVID was a perfect storm because the firms that were already dominant were also the ones that were best positioned to be resilient to COVID because they could all switch online to a large extent. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. It's very clear that they had a comparative advantage compared to some of their competitors because they could deliver so much online. So that gave them a boost. And after that, I think it's a bit more complicated. I think they also branched out in, many of them are like multi-product firms now, and they branch out in different dimensions. And then you have the AI wave that comes in, which brings in NVIDIA and indirectly also benefits the people who are going to be the end user of the high level chips. So I think that's probably a mix of all of that. How long it's going to last, it's not obvious, but the thing is, it is in the stock price. So that means the market is thinking it's going to last because the value of a company at any point in time depends on what's going to happen beyond a 5-year horizon. The value of a company is more than 90% the value we will deliver beyond the next 5 years. So at least you can say that the market anticipates that this is going to be pretty persistent. Now, the other way you can look at footprint is to look at how big the firms are compared to some more like real data. Number of employees, do they account for a large share of the labor force. You could look at their income, their sales, and stuff like that. And then if you do it that way, you find that none of these firms are very large by historical standards. So the US sales of Apple compared to the US GDP, there's nothing very surprising about it. It's actually smaller than what AT&T was at the time. And there was a mistake people kept making for a while, which is they would take the consolidated accounts, the worldwide sales of a company, say Apple, and then scale it by US GDP. And then they say, oh, Apple is big. Well, yeah, except you're mixing apples and bananas because, yeah, it's selling in the rest of the world. So either you scale by world GDP, the total income of Apple, or you scale the US sales of Apple by US GDP, but you don't consolidate one without consolidating the other. And if you do it either way correctly, then you find that by this metric, which are more like real economic metric, then firms of today are not larger than the firms of the past, actually. Neither in terms of sales, employment, anything, except for one thing, after tax income. And after tax income is in part because they make a lot of money and they pay lower taxes than before.
In terms of the market power and concentration, do you think that this could be kind of good concentration? Because those firms, for example, after COVID, like they were more resilient and then maybe produced even maybe cheaper and sold them for cheaper prices. So what is actually happening? Like those when we think about those big firms, if you think about their investments or productivity growth, is there something different happening in this part of the century?
Yes and no. I mean, no, in the sense that if you look at the productivity gains that were created by the top firms, that doesn't vary widely across vintages. So AT&T and then IBM and then Procter and Gamble, they all provided huge productivity gains for the US economy at the time at their peak. These gains are comparable to what, say, Google or Amazon are providing today. So in that sense, they are neither better nor worse than what we saw in the past. So I would say to a first order, it's not that different. And then if you go a little bit deeper, there is one dimension where it's somewhat different. It's the speed, at least for a consumer facing product, but actually even I think overall, actually, the speed at which you can become very large, that has increased somewhat because and that probably is actually a good side effect of the internet. Like customer acquisition can be that much faster. And so you can ramp it and become a very large firm very quickly in a way that probably was not possible in the past. So that part is new. And that part to me, has two interesting implications. The first, of course, is it's good, as with your first question. Yeah, that's the good side of entrepreneurship, the fact that you can create a good product and move from 10,000 to 10 million users and then a billion in a matter of months. I think that's which is roughly what GPT did. GPT did it, I don't know, twice faster than Instagram, which itself did it twice faster than Facebook, which itself did it 10 times faster than the previous one. So that's the good part. The challenge for regulation is it's hard to keep up. In the past, there was also another challenge. I think that's when I pushed against a little bit, which is this idea that these superstar tech firms are so special that we should not touch them. We should not apply to them the same standard we applied in the past because they can do no wrong. That was the strong belief of the 2010s, actually. So from 2010 to 2020, there was this idea that we should, in part, they convinced people of that through lobbying and political donations. But at the end, they did succeed in convincing most people that you shouldn't touch them. They are like the magic unicorns of the economy, and we should give them a free rein and a blank check on anything. And I think that was a mistake. And I think things would have been better if we hadn't done that. It's also somewhat behind us, to be honest, because it's like a timing issue. Like there's always a point where the firms have been greatly innovative, and now they are still innovative, but they're also abusing their market power a lot. And maybe that's a time where you want to slap them on the wrist. That time was the 2010s for these guys. Today, the game has changed. The competition for AI is just so massive that it's actually recreating quite a bit of competition in that field, I would argue. And so it is going to replace, maybe to some extent, the fact that we didn't act earlier. So you could say, well, would have been better if we had acted 15 years ago. We didn't. It's not the end of the world.
Also, maybe one last question about research is, so maybe we can compare the US and Europe, because in
Yes.
Europe, it looks like I mean, there are more regulations when you think about those tax policies and stuff. It might differ from the US. So, how do you see the dynamic? What is happening in Europe and how is it different than the US? Is the picture gloomy or better?
It is gloomy in some countries. And to me, that actually goes back to the question that you asked earlier, which I did not answer, which is this idea of productivity growth and the slowdown. So that's the research I've been working on the past 2 years. And there, it's actually a lot more subtle than people realize. So first of all, what do we mean by productivity slowdown? It's going to be it sounds a bit technical, but it's not that complicated. Like, is it in percent or is it in value created? Because like, in other words, take an economy and you said, do we think that it's natural for for productivity to grow 2% per year? Well, 2% per year is a very specific process that grows exponentially. And if that's the benchmark, you have to realize that it predicts crazy stuff for the future because it compounds. And then you might have to wait a bit, but anything that compounds like that eventually goes banana. And I think if you look at the history of this, so that dates back to Bob Solo's research from the 1950s. But when he wrote his growth model initially, he was like, it looks convenient to assume that the growth rate in percent is stable because it was roughly stable and the period he looked at and it was not rejected by the data. But Bob didn't take that specific thing that seriously. He didn't want to say like for sure it's going to be an exponential, like a geometric process. And then we took it for granted because it's actually convenient in our model. But I think it's the wrong way to think about it, which is the technological progress is much more additive than multiplicative most of the time. And so now when the economy is very, very large, you can still add a lot of value in a given year. It's not going to look like a very big percent of the economy. Or in other words, like when the US economy started to grow very fast, which is around 1930, it started from a low base. It was so much easier to get 5%, 6% growth. But today, 6% growth for the US economy would be such a massive amount of value created that it's a lot harder. And you can apply that firm by firm as well. So my first thing to say there is I think the benchmark for productivity growth is somewhat misleading, which is there is no reason to expect productivity growth in percent to be the key number. If we add a good chunk of value each year, we should be happy with that. And now as we get richer, it is going to look as a smaller fraction of what we already have. But it's not, I wouldn't necessarily call that a slowdown. It's just the way it is. It's like the flip side of being super rich. So I think that's the first thing. Now, so I view the data in that lens. Now, if I look at the data that way, I think in the US, for me, there is no slowdown in the sense that the quantity of economic value added by productivity each year is actually stable. And the only reason we used to grow at 3% instead of 2% is because we are twice richer today. It's not like such a bad thing. In Europe, if you apply that benchmark, you find that there are countries that are essentially on the same trajectory of the US. And the names won't surprise you. Sweden, Denmark, they look very, very similar. And then you have countries that for a while were parallel to the US and now are falling behind. And that's going to be France, the UK to some extent, and also Germany today. That they don't, even with my slightly adjusted benchmark, they can't quite keep up. So in that sense, yes, I think there is an issue for Europe right there. And it is, yes, it is linked to innovation. Now, the thing I was pushing against in the book is the idea that Europe did everything wrong. And in particular, I think for consumer protection, Europe did very well. And then we do have many products and services are much more affordable now in Europe than in the US, thanks to this very strong antitrust, which was inspired by the US, which is the funny part, which is like what made Europe's market more competitive was not like an invention of the Europeans. It was pretty much copy-paste from the US playbook at the time where the US was itself forgetting its own playbook, which is kind of the irony of the story.
It is interesting. Yeah. So maybe to wrap up this research part, can you tell us kind of gaps in the literature? Like what are you currently working on? And if you could recommend to an early career researcher, like these are the areas that we still don't have an answer to, or like we still have, I don't know, mixed answers, like, and we need more answers or different opinions on this. What do you think those areas are?
So, if you ask this question to researchers, we have the unfortunate tendency of only thinking about the stuff we've been doing the past 6 months. And so I will not break that tradition and talk about the stuff that right now I'm still confused about. So, I mean, one way that I think is fair enough is we make a big deal of the relative lack of productivity or growth in Europe compared to the US. But it turns out that that depends a lot on how you measure things. And it depends a lot on which price series you use. And most people don't realize that. So whether Europe has lost 20% of GDP per capita relative to the US over the past 20 years or 30 years depends essentially how you measure the cost of living. There are, I realized, much wider inconsistencies in the way we do it than I thought initially. So we have the national accounts in the US and Europe, and they give a picture. And usually that's the one that people use to conclude that Europe has fallen behind in terms of income per capita by something like 15-20%. But that, if you use prices that people use for PPP, so comparing income across countries, you find that none of that is there. In fact, if anything, Europe is, maybe slightly about the same. And why? Just because some of the prices we measure are just totally misleading. And sometimes it's for the right reason, because it's conceptually difficult. But sometimes it's also for the wrong reason, because we don't spend enough time thinking about exactly how we measure these prices. And I think that I do believe that the big data AI revolution has totally not entered that field. With the data collection and the data processing is still like Middle Ages in my mind. This should be done in such a better way with the modern tools that we have. So I think that's one big thing that is ripe for just better treatment. And otherwise, in terms of a young researcher, I mean, I think the advice that if you're gonna work on a topic for 5 years in your dissertation, you better like it. And it's a pure it is not like it is not wishful thinking, or it's not just to sound nice. It's pragmatic, because you need to be motivated. So if I was starting today, I think like this AI impact is so striking that I think that it would have to be part of what I would do as a young researcher. Maybe it's always good to have a slightly different perspective on a topic than most people, because that makes you more likely to say something new. So that's cultivate this kind of creativity. In economics, I still like, if I think about the things we have roughly right in our models versus roughly wrong, it's still the case that the way we model how people think and make decisions and their beliefs, I would still put that first and foremost as the weak point of our theory.
These are really great suggestions. Thank you very much. Let's switch to some cheesy questions and then we'll wrap this episode up. I'm asking to a French this question to a French person, but if you were allergic to one food, what would you be absolutely devastated to give up?
Cheese.
Yeah.
Easy. If you consider wine a food, that would cheese and wine definitely would be the two things that would be dramatic.
Got it. So, another one, if you couldn't be an economist in a parallel universe, and now I'm also going to assume that you can't be a physicist, what would you be doing?
Rock climbing. I'd be a mountain guide for sure.
So, you do rock climbing then now as well? That's amazing. And if you could live in someone's brain for a day, who would you choose? Who would that be?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I mean, honestly, and it's not because you're in the UK, but I would say I would have two choices. One would be Shakespeare, because it's just like, I don't think he himself could have imagined the impact he had on the world today. Like, I don't think it was even possible for him to imagine that so many hundreds of years after, what he wrote is still like amazingly relevant and played and everything. So I think that would be for sure one. And then another one would be maybe in the head of one of these Roman emperors, right at the time where they switched from the old, like right at the time where they kind of didn't really believe in their old gods anymore, but Christianity was not there. So there was this period of time where they kind of understood that these stories of the old gods coming from the Greek was kind of like child fairy tales, so they kind of really didn't really take them seriously anymore. But the Christianity hadn't spread, and so there was this time period. It's a bit like around like the Emperor Hadrian or something, where they had this freedom of thinking, and I would have loved to be in their mind at that time, thinking, what were they actually thinking? I mean, talking about stuff that I could never do, like very far away, that I could never do myself. That would be really exotic. So I think that would be the two.
Well, these are interesting and great choices. So let me ask you a few more never have I ever questions. Those are a bit different, but I mean, if you have done it, you can say, I've done this, or I do this all the time. Or if you haven't, you just say, you've never done it. But never have I ever skipped sessions in a conference just to explore the city.
Oh, I have done that.
I guess many of us probably did that. Never have I ever thought we already knew this during a seminar.
I think of it oftentimes. Yes,
I see. Never have I ever regretting not writing something sooner.
I did. I did regret not writing something sooner. Yes.
Which paper, or was it written by someone else?
Oh, it was when I was a student, and I found a mistake in a pretty influential paper that was published a year. And instead of trying to just quickly write the note to say, well, there was a math mistake, here's what the right solution, I was convinced by an advisor whose name we shall not say, no, just try to do something more than that. And of course, I did that. So that's one example.
I see. Thank you very much, Thomas. It was great to talk to you. And I hope our listeners also enjoyed the talk. And see you in the next episode, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.